Hello, I'm Aurelia Skipwith, Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I am delighted to be here with you today, virtually at the EarthX Conservation Conference. I was born and raised in Indianapolis, Indiana, but my connection to the outdoors flourished when I spent my summers down in Mississippi, where I helped my grandpa on his hog farm and his garden and trapezing around the woods and tending to his hound dogs. It was during those summers that I gained a deep appreciation for the outdoors and wildlife. I spent countless hours outdoors exploring. And that is where my grandpa taught me. If you don't grow it, catch it, or kill it, then you didn't eat it. And one of those guiding principles that stuck with me since that time is the importance of people and their communities in conserving their natural resources. Back then, I didn't know that taking care of the land and the animals that lived on it was called conservation. But I realize now that that is what conservation is all about. People being stewards of the land. Back then, all we knew was that it was a way of life. Today, more than ever, conserving our nation's wildlife heritage presents many complex challenges. I call those opportunities that will require an unprecedented level of cooperation and trust among federal, state, tribes, partner organizations, and private landowners. Addressing issues such as catastrophic wildfire, invasive species, habitat fragmentation, and many others require collaboration across political and geographic boundaries. To be successful, we also need to ensure what we do in support of wildlife conservation is also relevant to the people in their communities. Effective conservation is as much about people as it is about wildlife. Take, for example, the species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act. Over half of the endangered species live on private land, so getting the support and help from the people that own and make a living off of those lands are critical to our recovery efforts here at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Voluntary partnerships and agreements on related private lands are important to more than just imperiled species. In 2019 alone, through partnerships with private landowners, we were able to complete restoration and enhancement projects on over 200,000 acres, on 19,000 wetland acres, and 189 river miles. That's a lot of conservation benefiting a lot of wildlife and for the people who enjoy being outdoors. We have the world's most extensive and interconnected network of protected public lands and comprehensive protections for native wildlife and their habitat. You need only visit our nation's public lands to see that our wildlife heritage is truly exceptional and flourishing. And a big thank you goes to hunters and anglers. They want to see that there's an abundance of fish and wildlife for many generations to come. And I understand the importance of hunting and fishing to conservation. I am reminded of it daily from my family of ranchers in Montana and South Dakota and farmers in Mississippi. Our success is based on the North American wildlife conservation model, and that has two basic principles. The first, that fish and wildlife belong to all Americans. And two, that fish and wildlife populations need to be sustained for future generations to enjoy. So the decisions that we make today are imperative to what happens tomorrow. Hunting and fishing on public lands plays an integral role in the success of our country's wildlife conservation model. Hunters and anglers lead the way by pouring billions of dollars into conservation through excise taxes on their equipment and fuel. When those funds are combined with the state license and tag sales sportswomen and men pay each year, it constitutes the majority of funding for wildlife conservation in North America. And it's not just funding for the huntable wildlife or sport fish, but it's for all wildlife. And it's paid by the sportswomen and men. Hunting and fishing, as well as other activities that depend on access to public lands. These activities also pay and create jobs. They pour millions of dollars into local communities each year. Last year, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service alone hosted more than 59 million visitors, and their spending generated more than $3 billion in sales in local economies, supporting over 41,000 jobs. President Trump has led the way in providing more access to our federal lands. Since the beginning of the Trump administration, we have opened more than 4 million acres to hunting and fishing on national wildlife refuges and national fish hatcheries. Continuing those unprecedented efforts, we recently announced the historic opening and expansion of over 850 hunting and fishing opportunities across more than 2.3 million acres, representing 97 refuges and 9 hatcheries. This rule, led by President Trump and Secretary Bernhardt, is the single largest expansion of hunting and fishing opportunities by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in our history. We are also working with state and federal partners to prioritize and conserve Western big game corridors. And just last year, we appointed 10 permanent, dedicated staff across the country to work full-time on increasing hunting and fishing access and reducing or eliminating unnecessary regulations. Theodore Roosevelt, who almost single-handedly launched the conservation movement in America, understood that conserving our natural heritage is inextricably linked to American democracy and freedom. That is why Roosevelt saw the protection and restoration of public lands for the benefit of all Americans as his most important conservation legacy. We are actively working to continue that legacy by increasing opportunities for all Americans to enjoy their public lands. In August of this year, President Trump signed into law the Great American Outdoors Act. It is one of the greatest conservation achievements in U.S. history since Theodore Roosevelt, and a significant milestone in conserving our nation's wildlife heritage. This legislation was passed by the leadership of President Trump and is a lasting legacy to his and our nation's conservation efforts. The Great American Outdoors Act provides permanent funding to the Land and Water Conservation Fund at $900 million per year, which is derived from royalties paid by energy companies drilling for oil and gas on the outer continental shelf. The funding will be used to conserve public lands and support outdoor recreation across the U.S. The Great American Outdoors Act could not have come at a better time for this country. As we continue to conquer COVID-19, the public has found refuge in nature, particularly within our national wildlife refuges, which have remained open during this time. Our national wildlife refuges across the country provide an unparalleled opportunity for Americans to experience nature and recreate outdoors. I like to remind people that our national wildlife refuges were set up for social distancing long before we ever heard of the word COVID. Now more than ever, the enormous conservation opportunities that await us will require an unprecedented level of cooperation and trust among federal agencies, partner organizations, and most importantly, private landowners, states, and tribes. We will work shoulder to shoulder with others on conservation across this nation. And we are open to working directly with organizations to ensure that they and the public have a greater voice in the decisions regarding our work. As director, and on behalf of the entire U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I encourage all of you to get outside and enjoy your public lands, and in doing so, continue the American tradition of wildlife conservation. Thank you.